Welcome. My name is Lillian Anderson, and I'm a member of Reclaim Our Democracy, based right here at First Parish in Concord. And on behalf of our organization, we are delighted that you have come today, this afternoon, to hear about how democracies die. I'm going to introduce you to Stephen Levitsky, and well, actually, I'll backtrack a little bit. I picked up the book, How Democracies Die, during the summer. And I read it, and I couldn't put it down. I was so moved, not only by the fact that this book helped me to understand the complexity of where we are in our current political environment, but also because at the end of the book it gives you hope. It gives you some idea of how we can move forward on this. So we have, the book is co-authored by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. Unfortunately, Daniel had a family emergency which precluded him from coming today, but he did write an email saying that Stephen is definitely the more charismatic speaker, so we're in good hands here. So let me tell you a little bit about Stephen Levitsky. He is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University. At Harvard, he also serves on the executive committees of both Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. He received a BA in political science from Stanford University in 1990 and a PhD also in political science from the University of California, Berkeley in 1999, and has taught at Harvard since 2000. His research interests include political parties and party building, authoritarianism and democratization, and weak and informal institutions with a focus on Latin America. He's the author of several books and also articles. He is currently writing a book with Luke and Wei on the durability of revolutionary regimes. But Steve is here today to discuss his current and instructive book, How Democracies Die, written with Daniel Ziblatt. So please welcome Stephen Levitsky.
Thanks, everyone. Can I put this somewhere else?
Oh, I'll take it.
Thanks. So I was gonna thank everyone for skipping the Patriots to come hear me, but I heard the Patriots are getting their butts kicked, right? So that's why you're all here. So thank you to Reclaim Our Democracy, and thank you to the First Parish Church for having me. Daniel, my co-author, as Lillian said, had a family complication and couldn't make it. I don't know what he was talking about the who's the charismatic one, but it's a pity because Daniel's actually the smart one. So we'll see if I can get along without him. So the 2016 election raised a question that Daniel and I never, ever thought that we would ask, and that is whether American democracy could possibly be in danger. Like the vast majority of Americans, we had both always taken the stability of American democracy for granted. And there's very good reason for this. No democracy, even remotely as rich or as old as American democracy, has ever broken down. And yet Donald Trump's selection of the presidency seemed to place us in uncharted territory. 40 years ago, the great Spanish political scientist Juan Linz, who taught for many years at Yale, developed in a book what he called a litmus test for authoritarian behavior. And we present a kind of a refined version of that litmus test in the first chapter of our book. Donald Trump tested unambiguously positive on that litmus test. He suggested that he might not, and this is just during the campaign, he suggested he might not abide by the results of the election. He threatened legal action against critics in the media. He threatened to lock up his opponent, and he condoned and even encouraged violence. No major party presidential candidate in modern American history had ever behaved remotely in that manner. But Daniel and I had seen behavior like that before. Daniel had seen it in his research on Europe during the 1930s, and I'd seen it in my research in Latin America. So watching the 2016 campaign, watching it unfold, gave both of us the feeling that we'd seen this movie before. And unfortunately, it's a movie that often does not end well. So we decided to write a book that tries to draw lessons from other democracies in crisis that we can hopefully apply here in the United States. The book does not declare that American democracy is dead. It does not declare that American democracy is dying. But it does point to some warning signs. And it makes the case that we can no longer take our democracy for granted. And I'm going to make that case today. As I begin, it's important to point out that democracies no longer die the way they used to die. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns. During the Cold War, for most of the 20th century, 3 out of every 4 democratic breakdowns took the form of a classic military coup. The generals seized power. Contemporary democracies die in much more subtle ways. Today, most democracies die at the hands not of generals, not of men with guns, but elected presidents and elected prime ministers who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. They use elections. They use acts of Congress. They use Supreme Court rulings. This is Hugo Chavez, Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, Erdogan in Turkey, Duterte in the Philippines. One of the things that's so dangerous about this electoral road to autocracy is that it happens behind a facade of democracy. There are no tanks in the streets. The Constitution remains intact. Elections continue to be held. Congress continues to function. In fact, many of the steps that are taken to undermine democracy are packaged and sold to the public as measures to enhance public security, to combat corruption, to clean up the electoral process. And as a result, many citizens often are not aware that they're losing their democracy until it's too late. Just to give one example, in 2011, 12 years into Hugo Chavez's presidency in Venezuela, surveys showed that a good-sized majority of Venezuelans still believed that they were living in a democracy. So if democratic breakdown today begins at the ballot box, not in the barracks, one of the keys to protecting democracy lies in keeping authoritarians from getting elected in the first place. And here political parties play a really important role. Parties are democracy's gatekeepers. Elected authoritarians almost never come to power on their own. They almost always get help from somebody in the political establishment. Somebody gets up and opens the gates for them. This is usually based on a tragic miscalculation. Some mainstream parties, some mainstream politicians believe that working with the outsider, working with the demagogue, will help them politically in the short run. It'll help them win an election, or it'll help them keep a hated rival from winning power. That bargain often backfires. In Italy in the 1920s, liberal leader Giovanni Giolitti, seeking to tap into Mussolini's mass appeal, included the fascists on his party's list for parliament. Within a year or so, Mussolini was prime minister, Giolitti was out of politics. In Weimar Germany, conservatives in the late 20s began working with the Nazis, trying to tap into Hitler's grassroots support to shore up their own party's declining base. In 1933, when conservative leader Franz von Papen was trying to calm down fellow conservatives who were worried about Hitler being named chancellor, told them, and I quote, "Don't worry, within 2 months we'll have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll squeal." In both of these cases, in Italy and Germany, mainstream politicians, mainstream liberal or conservative parties, abandoned their gatekeeping role and let extremists, thank you, through the door. In both of those cases, it turned out to be a tragic miscalculation. Now, historically, American parties have done a fantastically good job of gatekeeping. The United States has had no shortage of extremist demagogues over the years. Father Coughlin, Henry Ford, Huey Long, Joe McCarthy, George Wallace. Surveys showed that each of these figures at one point enjoyed up to 30–35% public support, which is not far from President Trump's support base. But none of these figures that I just named made it anywhere close to the presidency. They were kept out in large part by the candidate selection process. Prior to 1972, as most of you know, U.S. presidential candidates were selected by party leaders in conventions, and usually what we think of as smoke-filled back rooms. Now, this old system, the old convention system, was not very transparent. It was not very inclusive. It was not very democratic. But it was a pretty good filtering mechanism. Party leaders served as gatekeepers. They had worked with all the potential candidates. They knew their strengths. They knew their weaknesses. They knew how these potential candidates dealt with things like stress and adversity. And they knew which of these guys, and they were guys at the time, were potential demagogues. In fact, for all of their very real shortcomings, the old convention system had a perfect record in terms of keeping demagogues out. Now, beginning in 1972, of course, the convention system was replaced by a system of binding primaries. The primary system, the system we have today, is far, far more democratic, far more transparent, far more inclusive than the system we had before. But it has weakened party leaders' role as gatekeepers. So now, when a demagogue runs for office, it is much, much harder to keep him or her out. And that's what we saw in 2016. So primaries, we're not saying get rid of primaries, but it's important to realize that primaries are double-edged. They are without question much more democratic, but they leave us more vulnerable to electing demagogues. Now, even after Trump's nomination, Republican Party gatekeepers failed a second time. Spanish political scientist Juan Linz, the guy who came up with the litmus test, devoted a good chunk of his career to studying why and how democracies die. One of the lessons that he took, particularly from studying the breakdown of democracy, the failure of democracy in Europe in the 1930s, was that mainstream political parties must do everything possible to keep extremists from the center of power, even if it means joining forces with their ideological rivals, even if it occasionally means supporting their ideological rivals in defense of democracy. Now, joining forces with your ideological rivals to oppose a demagogue who's on your side of the political spectrum is hard to do. It's hard for politicians to do. It risks angering the base, and it very often means short-term political defeat, and no politician anywhere likes to lose. So politicians, not wanting to do this, often rationalize. They tell themselves, the demagogue may not be so bad. They tell themselves they can control him, and they tell themselves, therefore, that the demagogue is still better than handing power to their partisan rivals. That's what Republican Party leaders did in 2016. Republican leaders, if you spoke to them in private, knew that Donald Trump was a demagogue. They knew damn well that he was unfit for the office of the presidency. But no major Republican leader was willing to do the one thing that would have assured that Donald Trump not win the presidency. That is endorse Hillary Clinton. Not a single prominent Republican elected official endorsed Clinton. Not one governor, not one senator, one member of the House of Representatives, but he was retiring. That was a crucial, that's the fact that Republicans unanimously either endorsed Trump, very often with a grimace, but endorsed Trump, or basically just hid under the table and said nothing. That sent a crucial signal to Republican voters. It told Republicans that Trump was an acceptable candidate, and that this was basically, at the end of the day, a normal election. That turned our election in 2016 into a standard two-party race. And a two-party race in a country with a so-so economy and a president with middling approval ratings in this country could go either way. And it happened to go Trump's way. So now Americans have a would-be authoritarian in the White House. You know all this. This is where our political institutions come into play. And this is where things get interesting. Americans have a lot of faith in our Constitution, and for a very good reason. We have the oldest, we have the most successful Constitution on earth. Our system of checks and balances has contained a large number of powerful and ambitious presidents in the past. It may well contain Trump. But one thing that became clear in researching this book is that constitutions by themselves are never enough to protect a democracy. Even the best written constitutions do not work automatically. They have to be reinforced by strong democratic norms or unwritten rules. And our book focuses on two of these unwritten rules in particular. One is what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of our partisan opponents. This is very simple. It means that no matter how much we may disagree with our partisan rivals, and no matter how much we may dislike our partisan rivals, we recognize, both in private and in public, that they are loyal citizens who love the country as much as we do and who have an equal and legitimate right to compete for office, and if they win, to govern us. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as dangerous enemies. The second norm, a little more complicated, is what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of deliberate self-restraint. It is an underutilization of one's power. We do not think very often about forbearance in politics, but it's absolutely crucial. Think about what the US president is constitutionally, legally able to do. The president can pardon whomever she wants, whenever she wants. Any president with a majority in both houses of Congress can pack the Supreme Court. If you do not like the ideological composition of the Supreme Court, you can expand it to 11, expand it to 13, fill it with ideological allies. That is perfectly legal. The president can also circumvent Congress and make policy through presidential proclamations and executive decrees. The Constitution does not explicitly prohibit that kind of action. Or think about Congress and what it has the legal authority to do. Congress can refuse to fund the government. It can effectively shut down the government. It can prevent the president from filling his or her cabinet posts. It can prevent the president, as you know, from filling Supreme Court seats. It can impeach the president on virtually any grounds that it wants. My point here is that politicians can exploit the letter of the Constitution, even a really good Constitution, in ways that eviscerate its spirit. Court packing, partisan impeachment, government shutdowns. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet calls this behavior, using the letter of the law to subvert the spirit of the law, he calls it constitutional hardball. You look at any failing or failed democracy in the world, and you will find an abundance of constitutional hardball. You will find politicians using the letter of the law to hack away at its spirit. Spain and Germany in the 1930s, Argentina under Perón, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, contemporary Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Philippines. Let me give you one example from my region of the world. Argentina's 1853 Constitution was a virtual exact replica of the US Constitution. One study found that 2/3 of it are essentially plagiarized from the US Constitution. It is a virtual copy. But Juan Perón used that very Constitution to undermine Argentine democracy. One of the first moves that Perón made after winning the presidency in 1946 was to have Congress impeach 3 out of 5 justices of the Supreme Court on grounds of malfeasance. That move was technically constitutional. Just like here in the United States, you can also impeach Supreme Court justices. Congress then passed a law that made it a crime to disrespect the president. When opposition leader Ricardo Balbín was arrested under this law and challenged its constitutionality in the Supreme Court, the packed court upheld the law. Again, technically legal. What prevents a constitutional democracy from descending into this kind of constitutional hardball is forbearance. It is a shared commitment among politicians to institutional restraint, to not using the letter of the law to subvert its spirit. Think about presidential re-election historically in the United States. As all of you know, prior to 1951, the United States Constitution placed no limit at all on presidential re-election. Legally, American leaders could have been president for life, just like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, just like Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. But for nearly 150 years, following a precedent set by George Washington, no president, no sitting president sought a 3rd term. It is not the US Constitution that prevented ambitious presidents like Jefferson, like Andrew Jackson, like Grant, from seeking a 3rd term. It was a norm of forbearance. It was a norm of restraint. Or take the Senate filibuster, historically. Technically, as you know, a Senate minority can use the filibuster to block virtually every move made by the majority. But prior to 1970s, 1980s, the filibuster was very rarely used. It was seen by politicians on both sides of the aisle as a procedural weapon of last resort. The U.S. Senate recorded an average of 1 filibuster per year between 1917 and 1960. Senators exercised forbearance, restraint. These two norms, norms of mutual toleration and forbearance, serve as what Daniel and I call the soft guardrails of democracy. They are what prevent healthy, normal political competition from descending into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracies in Europe in the 1930s and in South America in the 1960s and 70s. Now, U.S. democracy has not always had these soft guardrails. Didn't have them in the 1790s when partisan warfare between the Federalists and the Republicans nearly destroyed the Republic before it took root. It lost whatever democratic norms it had in the run-up to the Civil War. Mutual toleration remained very low in the generation following the Civil War. Southern Democrats viewed Republican Reconstruction as an existential threat. Republicans tended to view Southern Democrats as traitors. The 1860s, 1870s, early 1880s were replete with constitutional hardball, changes to the size of the Supreme Court in 1866, 1869, the impeachment of the president in 1868, a fraudulent election in 1876. So democratic norms, norms of mutual toleration and forbearance, only really took root again in the late 19th century. And they did so, tragically, only after Republicans had abandoned the goal of racial equality. Only after Republicans allowed Southern Democrats to disenfranchise blacks and establish Jim Crow and single-party rule in the South. Once the Republicans backed off Reconstruction, once they backed off the goal of racial equality, Democrats in the South stopped viewing the Republicans as an existential threat, and the two parties could begin to coexist. This is an important point. It'll come back up. The norms of mutual toleration and forbearance, the very real norms of mutual toleration and forbearance that served as a foundation for 20th century democracy, that served as a foundation for the democracy that we grew up in, emerged out of a profoundly undemocratic arrangement: racial exclusion and the establishment of single-party rule in the U.S. South. With that caveat in mind, norms of mutual toleration and forbearance were pretty strong in 20th century American democracy. Throughout the 20th century, Democrats and Republicans accepted one another as legitimate and avoided destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. There were no impeachments. There were no successful court packings. Senators exercised their right to advice and consent with restraint, and presidents had their Supreme Court nominees approved almost all the time, even when the other party controlled the Senate, something that's almost unthinkable today. And outside of wartime, in the 20th century, presidents refrained from acting unilaterally at the margins of either Congress or the Supreme Court. So for more than a century, from the late 20th century into the late 21st century, late 19th century to late 20th century, late in the day. For a little more than a century, our system of constitutional checks and balances worked pretty well. But again, it worked because it was reinforced by norms, informal norms, unwritten rules of mutual toleration and forbearance. We argue in the book that America's democratic norms, these two norms, have been eroding in the United States for the last quarter century. There were signs of this beginning in the 1990s. Newt Gingrich, who became House Speaker in 1995, instructed his Republican colleagues, starting in the late 80s, to use terms like betray, anti-flag, and traitor to describe the Democratic Party. In other words, he encouraged his fellow Republicans to abandon language of mutual toleration. Gingrich was also a master of constitutional hardball. He engineered the first major government shutdown of the modern era. Basically, the idea was, and I'm sure you guys remember, if the president doesn't give us what we want, we'll just stop funding the government. We'll just shut it down. That was technically legal. It was a reckless precedent, one that we're still grappling with. 3 years later, Republican House carried out a partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton, basically on a technicality. That was the first impeachment in the United States in 130 years. But the process of norm erosion really accelerated in the 2000s, in the early part of the 21st century. The Tea Party movement in particular radicalized the Republican Party, encouraging Republican leaders to abandon mutual toleration. So Republican leaders like Gingrich, Palin, Giuliani, Huckabee told their followers, both privately and publicly, that President Obama did not love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans. The birther movement went, of course, a bit further, questioning whether President Obama was an American citizen at all. Just to give you one example of a quote, Colorado Congressman Mike Coffman, who actually was just defeated the other day, declared in, I think it was 2010, I do not know if Barack Obama was born in the United States of America, but I do know this, in his heart, he's not an American. He's just not an American. Now, all of you know, America has always had an extremist fringe. The thing is, this was no longer fringe politics. These were national Republican leaders. This was the party's 2016 presidential candidate. This was the National Republican Convention on primetime television chanting, "Lock her up." This worries us. This worries us because in the absence of mutual toleration, when we begin to view the other side as an enemy, as an existential threat, we start to abandon forbearance for constitutional hardball. When we view our partisan rivals as an enemy, when we view our partisan rivals as an existential threat to us, we become tempted to use any means necessary to thwart them, to beat them, to keep them out of power. And that's exactly what has begun to happen over the last decade. When Republicans won control of Congress in 2010, they adopted a strategy of outright obstructionism. They shut down the government a couple times, one time nearly throwing the country into default. There were more filibusters during Barack Obama's second term as president than in all the years between World War I and the end of the Reagan presidency combined. Now, President Obama responded with constitutional hardball of his own. When Congress refused to pass immigration reform, when Congress refused to pass climate legislation, he circumvented Congress and made policy via executive decree. That action was technically legal, it was constitutional, but it clearly violated the spirit of the Constitution. By the end of the Obama presidency, by 2016, Republicans in particular seemed willing to use any means necessary to prevent Democrats from winning. Probably the most stunning, the most prominent act of constitutional hardball was the Senate's decision in 2016 not to allow President Obama to fill a Supreme Court vacancy created by Justice Scalia's death. That move, not allowing the president even to get a hearing, even to nominate somebody, was unprecedented since 1866. That may have been the most prominent act, but there were many others. More than a dozen states, all controlled by Republicans, adopted strict voter ID laws aimed at dampening turnout among poor and low-income voters. In North Carolina, after Democrats won the governorship in 2016, the Republican legislature passed a series of laws aimed at tilting the electoral playing field. They packed local electoral boards and reduced the size of the state appeals court by 2, essentially stealing 2 court seats from the incoming governor. And in West Virginia earlier this year, the state legislature impeached the entire Supreme Court. So the problem is not just that Americans elected a demagogue in 2016. That's problem enough. The problem is that we elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy were becoming unmoored. Till a couple of decades ago, there seemed pretty clearly to be limits to what American politicians could do or were willing to do. There seemed to be red lines that our politicians could not, or at least would not, cross. Those were norms of forbearance. Those red lines are now fading, which is what gives us the feeling that we're now kind of barreling down the highway politically without guardrails. So the question is, why is this happening, and what can we do about it? I have an answer to the first one, not a second one. We argue that what's driving norm erosion, what is driving the erosion of our guardrails, is polarization. Over the last 25 years or so, Republicans and Democrats have come to fear and loathe one another. In 1960, there was a survey that found 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said they would be unhappy if their kid married someone from the other party. 5%. Today, that number is 50%. According to a Pew survey from earlier this year, 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats say the other party makes them afraid. We have not seen this kind of partisan hatred since the end of Reconstruction. And this is not just traditional liberal conservative polarization. People do not fear and loathe one another over taxes or health care. It's more than that. Today's partisan differences run much deeper. They're about race, religion, and way of life. American parties have changed dramatically over the last 50 years, over our lifetimes. Back in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Republican and Democratic Party differed on a bunch of things, but culturally and demographically, they were very similar. Both parties were overwhelmingly white and Christian. Three changes have occurred over the last half century. First of all, the Civil Rights Movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and a large migration of newly enfranchised African Americans into the Democratic Party. Second, the United States experienced a massive wave of immigration, first from Latin America, secondarily from Asia. Most of those immigrants and their kids have found their way to the Democratic Party. Third, since Reagan, evangelical Christians, who used to be evenly distributed between the two parties, in fact, a little more Democrat than Republican in the 1970s, since the early 80s, evangelical Christians have migrated overwhelmingly into the Republican Party. What does that add up to? That adds up to the fact that Democrats and Republicans today are racially and culturally very different beasts. The Democrats are a rainbow coalition of urban, educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities. Nearly 50% of the Democratic Party vote now, today, is non-white. The Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly Christian. This is important because white Christians are not just any group. They were once not only an overwhelming electoral majority, but they used to sit unchallenged atop this country's social, economic, political, cultural hierarchies. So they filled the presidency, they filled Congress, they filled the Supreme Court, they filled all the governor's mansions. They were the pillars of local communities, they were the CEOs, they were the movie stars, they were the college professors, and crucially, they were the face of both the Democratic and Republican parties. Those days are long gone. But losing majority, and crucially, losing one's dominant social status can be deeply threatening. Many Republican voters, not all, but many Republican voters feel today like the country they grew up in or grew up with is being taken away from them. They feel that change to be an existential threat. And that is what we think is driving the Republican Party's extremism and ultimately polarization. The problem is that extreme polarization can kill a democracy. Milan Svolek, a political scientist at Yale, has shown that in the context of polarization, the context of growing polarization, partisans on both sides become increasingly tolerant of undemocratic behavior on their own side. Svolek found his initial research was on Venezuela, but lest you think this is a Latin America thing, he found exactly the same thing in the United States. Americans on both the left and the right will tolerate a fair amount of undemocratic behavior as long as it targets the other side. Those findings should worry us a lot. Tolerance for anti-democratic behavior by highly polarized partisans is what killed democracy in Spain in the 1930s. It's what killed democracy in Brazil in the 60s, Chile in the 1970s, Turkey and Venezuela in the 2000s. When politics is so deeply polarized that each side views a victory by the other side as something that is unacceptable, intolerable, beyond the pale, democracy is in trouble. When we view an opposition victory as intolerable, we start to justify using extraordinary means to prevent it. Means like violence, like election fraud, like coups. Now, Americans have not reached that point, but we have reached a point where, according to 2016 exit polls, 1 out of 4 Donald Trump voters, 1 out of every 4 people who pulled the lever for Donald Trump, believed that Donald Trump was not fit for the office of the presidency. And yet they still preferred him to Democrat. We've reached a point where, according to Gallup, Republicans now have a substantially higher approval rating of Vladimir Putin than of Hillary Clinton. Those are dangerous levels of polarization. Donald Trump is a symptom of that polarization. It's not a cause of it. And his departure, whenever that is, will not put an end to it. So, what can be done? I have no idea. But I have to talk anyway. Couple of things. For one, it's absolutely clear the Republican Party has to change. It has to become a more diverse political party. As long as the Republican Party remains overwhelmingly white and Christian in a society as diverse as ours, it will be prone, forever prone, to polarizing white nationalist extremism. So it must become a party that can win votes among other groups of people. What can Democrats do? One thing Democrats can do is take steps to reduce inequality. Levels of income inequality are higher than at any point since before the Great Depression. Between 1975 and 2015, the bottom 40% of American society saw its income stagnate. No gains at all over 2 generations. For the first time, I think for the first time ever, an entire generation of Americans is growing up to be less well off than its parents. At the same time that the bottom 40% has stagnated for 2 generations, the top 5% in this country has seen its income nearly double. Rising inequality, steeply rising inequality, has created a profound sense of unfairness among many Americans, and that has helped to fuel racial resentment. There's no question that rising inequality and declining social mobility have contributed to both polarization and right-wing populism in this country. The Democratic Party stopped talking seriously about inequality, about redistribution, back in the 1990s, back in the Clinton era. It should take up those issues again. Our democracy may depend on it. I want to close, though, with a few words about what Democrats should not do. There's a lot of talk in progressive circles these days about learning how to fight like Republicans. The argument goes something like this. From the 2000 election in Florida, remember that? To Merrick Garland, to Brett Kavanaugh, Democrats have repeatedly been sucker punched. If Republicans are going to continue to play constitutional hardball, the Democrats have to fight back. They have to play tit for tat. Using forbearance while the other guy is playing hardball is like going into a boxing ring with a hand tied behind your back. Political scientist David Ferris just published a book a few months ago entitled "It's Time to Fight Dirty." The book explicitly calls on Democrats to take up a strategy of constitutional hardball. Ferris says Democrats should adopt a strategy of procedural warfare. They should pack the Supreme Court when they get the chance. They should use every obstructionist tactic possible to grind Congress to a halt while Trump is president. He even says they should break up California into 7 states in order to manufacture a Democratic majority in the Senate. I'm not sure how he's going to pull off that one, but good luck. Danley and I were fortunate enough to talk to a group of 7 Democratic senators last month. And it's clear they are under a lot of pressure to engage in more hardball tactics. Shut down the government to protect DACA. Use any means necessary to prevent Trump from filling yet another Supreme Court seat if that arises. Impeach Trump. Pack the Supreme Court next time that they hold power in order to sort of halt the court's rightward tilt. Now that view is understandable. It appeals to people's sense of urgency and it appeals to people's sense of justice. But we think it's a mistake. A strategy of constitutional hardball inevitably will only accelerate the process of democratic norm erosion. In other words, it will further corrode our democratic guardrails. And in our experience, that sort of escalation, that sort of tit for tat of escalating constitutional hardball rarely ends well. Once the escalation begins, it becomes very, very difficult to stop. It becomes a death spiral. We saw this in Spain in the 1930s, saw it in Brazil in the 60s, Chile in the 1970s, Turkey and Venezuela in the 2000s. Now we realize that asking Democrats to stick with forbearance while they're getting sucker punched is a tough proposition. It puts Democrats in a tough position. But I want to suggest that a strategy of preserving democratic norms is actually in the Democratic Party's long-run interest, in addition to being in our democracy's long-run interest. Conservative writer David Frum argues, and I think correctly, that the Republicans are playing dirty today because they're operating with very narrow time horizons. As the Republican Party is currently constituted, it's going to have a very hard time winning elections in the medium run. So it's desperately trying to grab as much, or hold on to, as much power as it can today. In other words, Republican hardball tactics are fundamentally acts of desperation. Democrats, by contrast, are in a different place. Their medium-term prospects are much better. The Democratic electorate is younger, and it's growing. The greatest threat to Democrats' medium-term prospects is an escalating conflict that puts our institutions at risk, that either destroys our democracy or leaves it completely dysfunctional in the medium term. So Democrats arguably have a longer-term interest in preserving our core democratic institutions. Playing recklessly with those institutions is not the way to preserve them. Daniel and I, actually, this is one of those areas where Daniel's the smart one. Daniel, I should say, likes to describe the dilemma that we face using the metaphor of global warming versus an earthquake. This is not a happy way to end, but I think I'm going somewhere with this. If the situation that we face in American politics is like global warming, then we can expect things to continually get worse and worse. Polarization will get worse and worse. The Republicans will get more and more radical. If that is the case, then we've got good reasons to abandon forbearance and take dramatic action. We need to do everything possible to stop the Republicans now before it's too late. This is the David Ferris time to fight dirty view. But what if the crisis is like an earthquake? Earthquakes are serious things. They emerge out of real fault lines. They do a lot of damage. But earthquakes eventually end. If our crisis is like an earthquake, then our response to it may have to be different. Our goal may be to get through the earthquake with the foundations of our democracy intact. So we may want to focus more on shoring up our institutions to prevent them from collapsing in order to get through the crisis without losing the things that we value the most, things like core democratic rights. As all of you know, it took almost 2 centuries. It took almost 2 centuries to build the democracy that we have now in the United States. We fought for 180 years to get basic civil and democratic rights for all Americans. This community in particular has been part of that struggle from the beginning, from Concord's abolitionist movement in the 1830s to this church's embrace of Black Lives Matter. The civil rights gains of the last 60 years were extraordinary achievements. We need to be very, very careful about protecting those achievements. We are in the middle of an enormous, enormous political earthquake. We've begun a transition as a society that, to my knowledge, no democracy has ever undergone successfully. That is one in which a previously dominant ethnic group loses its majority status. It's a transition to a truly multiracial democracy. I think America stands a very good chance of being the first country to make that transition successfully. But to get there, we are inevitably going to have to go through a process of really intense and polarizing reaction. This is our earthquake. During this period of intense and polarizing reaction, we cannot afford to be reckless with our institutions. We have far, far too much to lose. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, I know that all of you are going to rush to the Harvard website and enroll in Steve's political science class. But you know what? I have an easier solution for you. You can buy the book. So, and we'll allow you to do that in just a minute. Steve has kindly said that he will take questions. So we'll do that for probably, I would say 15 minutes, maybe 20, depending on what you have to ask. So I will circulate with the microphone. here it is, sorry. Got it. You're on. You can share, I mean, both of you can.
Oh, we have different
Different questions. You can.
Okay, I guess the question that I have is that my concern is that in being careful to not destroy our constitutional, legacy, are we at risk of destructive, horrible economic conditions whereby Medicare, Medicaid, all of our safety net is going to be diminished, our environment is going to be demolished, also, our unions are going to be further destroyed, the distribution of income is going to become, so pronounced that families aren't going to be able to have fruitful lives, et cetera, et cetera. What do we do about, the environment and economic welfare in the meantime?
That's a great question. I think one of the strongest comebacks, and I don't think anybody's got the answer to this question. One of the strongest comebacks to this sort of wait for the medium-term strategy is just how much substantive damage could be done in the short term. And you pointed to, I think, some of the crucial ones. And one that worries me terribly, worries a lot of people, is the environmental destruction. We don't have a lot of years left. We don't have a lot of years to play with. And so I think it's a very valid question. Let me just make one thing clear, though. We're not advocating going home and sitting on your couch. We're advocating preserving democratic norms. That doesn't mean that you and we can't go out and fight. That doesn't preclude protest. That doesn't preclude activism. That doesn't preclude campaigning and first and foremost, winning elections. So citizens should be more mobilized than ever before in defense, whether it's economic rights or social rights or environmental rights, as ever before. What we're arguing is that it's best not to bend our norms to do it.
Okay, you've got the microphone.
Thank you. Two things. One is a question. If I understood you correctly, my mind is heading toward a conspiracy behind 16, I think, Republican candidates dropping out of the Republican primary. That just boggled my mind for the last 2 years. I would wonder if you have some insight to that. And the second one is kind of like what my friend just said, but I'm worried about our political institutions. Can they survive? I am so scared that he's going to win another term. And that's like 6 years from now. I just see Armageddon. Scared.
So it would certainly be useful for our democracy if Donald Trump were not reelected. So we have a lot of work to do. And I think this last election was a major step, very, very important step. And opposition control of the House of Representatives is a really, really meaningful step forward. That said, most political analysts think it's about a 50-50 bet in 2020. So we have a lot of work to do. In terms of candidates, changes in our media structure, the ability to get one's name out without being on Walter Cronkite, without being on the 3 old networks, and changes in fundraising, the ability of someone like Bernie Sanders to go head-to-head with Hillary Clinton in fundraising, the fact that anybody can raise a lot of money via small donations to the internet, that has led to a proliferation of candidates. That's one of the major reasons why we had that, I would suggest to you, rather than a conspiracy, is why we had 16 candidates against Trump. Now, the existence of those 16 candidates helped Trump, because Trump, who's not an Einstein, deftly realized that crossing certain lines in terms, particularly in terms of racial politics and immigration, would appeal to a hardcore set of Republican voters. I don't know if it's 25%, 28%, but it got him hardcore support. So whereas the other Republicans were all sort of other Republican voters were dividing up among 16 candidates, he had that hardcore 28, because he was the only one willing to cross that line. It was brilliant. Now, I think we could have something similar in the Democratic Party primaries in 2020. We're going to have a very large number of candidates. We're going to have a very large number of good candidates, I think. Candidates that are very similar, candidates that are very qualified, candidates that even people who broadly agree on a lot of things in politics are going to split over. Somebody's going to like Kirsten Gillibrand, and somebody's going to like Joe Biden, and somebody's going to like Bernie Sanders, somebody's going to like Elizabeth Warren, and somebody's going to like Kamala Harris. Who we missed? Kamala Harris? Beto, right? See, Beto. So what does that mean? That means that somebody with a really hardcore 25% could be Bernie Sanders, whatever your opinion of him, could be some crazy outsider like Oprah or Michael Avenatti. If 16 good candidates split up the vote, somebody with a hardcore 25% can win plurality after plurality after plurality. It really makes the, as we saw in 2016, it makes the whole thing a bit of a, not a lottery, but it makes it very volatile.
Next. Okay, I'm going to try to be fair about this. Going back here.
Someone on Jim Browning, it might have been Andrea Carell, said that she felt that the Democrats in the House should work on getting legislation through, even if it didn't go through the Senate, just to show that Democrats care about living wage, environment, and all of those sorts of things. Do you think that makes sense other than, I mean, I think there's a lot of people who want to have the Democrats put their energy into impeaching Mr. Trump, but what do you think of her idea that we should be encouraging them to get a legislative record in the House, even though it can't become law?
So impeachment. Impeachment is a legal constitutional tool that, both in theory and in practice, is sometimes necessary. Sometimes you got to break the glass and use impeachment. I don't think we'll know whether impeachment, at least in my view, ought to be on the table until after we get the report of the Mueller investigation. There may be a scenario, there may well be a scenario, in which Mueller comes up with stuff that is so devastating that that constitutionally we really have no choice but to think seriously about impeachment. Until that happens, unless and until that happens, I think it would be a terrible mistake for the Democrats to focus on impeachment, because as things stand, impeachment is impossible. It's impossible because the votes aren't there for conviction in the Senate. It would simply be, it would be somewhat similar to, I'm not comparing Trump to Clinton, but it's similar to the impeachment in the 1990s, in which the Republicans impeached him basically to feed the base, because they knew he couldn't get through, conviction couldn't get through the Senate. So sort of playing symbolic politics with impeachment, I think, is a terrible mistake, because you would not get the outcome that you want, but you'd simply escalate the war and just lower the bar that much more for hardball politics. So I agree that the Democrats should focus on substance. Now, this is not to say they should not be providing heavy oversight of Trump. There's an awful lot to investigate, and Democrats without question will do that. But yes, they should be focusing on substantive issues, and things may change. If the economy gets worse, if Trump loses support, they may find allies in the Senate as the 2020 election approaches. They may find moderate Republicans who are willing to work with them and pass stuff. So I completely agree that they should focus on substantive legislation rather than hardball politics.
And she did say until Mueller comes back.
Yes.
I'm going over to this side now. I'm looking for a man. I could say that's true anyway, but you know.
Thank you for recognizing me. I wonder if you get an opportunity to speak in front of more Republican audiences and what your presentations are like there.
I don't, yeah, the answer is pretty short. We've not been invited by many Republican audiences. I mean, this is one of the problems that we face. I have to travel fairly long way to get serious, not necessarily Republican, but Trumpist audiences. So we've spoken to some audiences that are much more mixed than I would guess this one, in Louisville, Kentucky, in Pepperell, Massachusetts, which was over the front row were the town council people who were apparently all Republican. One at least had campaigned for Trump. So we've spoken to mixed audiences. I would love to get, and we've tried to reach out to speak to more Republican audiences, and largely have not gotten the invitations. No, I don't change the talk. I do not change the talk.
The city have an excellent message, and that is you're going to lose the intermediate battle. When the earthquake subsides, you're going to be in a much worse place. And so your message of it being a more inclusive party, so forth, would seem to be receptive at least to some Republicans.
Look, the Republican Party did a report, a 90-page report after Mitt Romney lost in 2012, which is commonly called the Republican Party autopsy of the 2012 election. You read that thing, as I read it right as we're writing the book, reads a lot like our chapter 9 of the book. It basically argues that Republicans have to become a more inclusive party. We have to reach young people, we have to reach people in the cities, we have to reach non-white voters, we have to reach women. Trump just abandoned our parties. This goes back to the gatekeeping idea that I talked about earlier in the talk. Our parties are very weak. Our party leaderships do not have the power to impose their will on parties. And so the Republican Party leadership issued this report, and nobody paid attention to it. And Trump went on to win the primary doing exactly the opposite of what their report said. So yes, I mean, we wrote the book with kind of never Trump Republicans, center-right Republicans in mind. We think that the core message is that they ought to embrace forbearance rather than face the wrath of angry, hardball-wielding Democrats in the medium run. And we've gotten sort of a mixed reception. But the Republican Party has Trumpized over the last decade, the last year. And for the most part, we haven't gotten many invitations from them.
Okay, I think I have a male youth.
Depends on definition of youth, I guess. My question is, there's a Cambridge political scientist professor, David Runciman, who also writes a similar topic. He wrote How Democracy Ends. He argues that's going to happen in new and surprising ways. These are, there are certain indicators, but it's possible that we may miss it when it does die. Will we know when it dies, or is it possible we'll miss it?
I mean, that depends. He's a philosopher, and he's writing at a very different level of abstraction than we are. I think it is possible to miss it. I think it's possible to miss early warning signs. And this is precisely, as I said at the beginning of the talk, precisely the danger of the way in which democracies die in the contemporary period. Very, very rarely do you see generals seize power anymore in coups and bombing the presidential palace and jailing, exiling, or killing the president. It's usually elected leaders themselves who use nominally democratic institutions, who use laws passed through Congress, who use referenda, who use Supreme Court rulings to slowly, subtly, incrementally weaken and then subvert democracy. And there's evidence from Hungary, there's evidence from Turkey, there's evidence, lots of evidence from Venezuela, that citizens do well into the destruction, well, a decade into the subversion of democracy, most citizens don't realize it. The government was elected. Now that is not, I'm talking on a different plane from Runciman, because he's making a much more abstract argument. But broadly, yes, the answer is yes. It's possible to miss it.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions, and so I'm going to go back here. We have not allowed these kind people.
What about the influence of hidden money, big money, corporate money, and how it's trying not only to buy candidates in elections, but after people are elected, orchestrating things from behind the scenes, so even when it appears that the people might be represented because they elected a certain individual, that in fact that is not how the laws are being written.
So there are many ways for democracies to die. There are many ways for democracy to be subverted. And big money is a way in which American democracy has been badly subverted for a long time, greatly exacerbated by the 2010 Supreme Court ruling. So I am in fact, there are some very smart, very mainstream political scientists who argue today that the influence of money on politics is so great that it really is a stretch to call our system a democracy, that we really are an oligarchy because citizens, there's always some gap in influence between everyday citizens and business or moneyed individuals, but the gap has grown so great that we see Congress behave in ways that are completely unresponsive to voters, that are nakedly, thoroughly responsive to donors. So that's happening. That's real, and that badly needs to be corrected. How? It's going to take...
Are you saying that's a sign? I just want to clarify.
Nope, I'm about to say that it's a distinct and not closely interrelated problem to the one we focus on in the book. It's not big money that got Donald Trump elected president. Donald Trump beat the Koch brothers. He beat the Koch brothers badly. It was not big money that created the populist coalition that now that now drives Trump. So there are, in essence, again, multiple ways to die, multiple maladies afflicting our democracy. The problem of money is huge. It's not the problem we focus on in the book. And I don't want to conflate the two, because they're not the same.
Okay, this is the last question. I'm going right over here.
So the words that that you want us to look at is sort of like forbearance, tolerance. Those are all human behavior, and I'd like to know your views on the systemic problems we have, such as social media, Facebook, where people are being swayed not through people behavior necessarily, but through some folks that are really swaying, spinning or swaying, and rumors and so on. That gets hugely propagated through social media. Are there guardrails? You mentioned about soft guardrails. What are the guardrails against that?
So, again, a very, very real problem. The impact of social media took most of us by surprise in 2016. It took politicians by surprise. It took Facebook by surprise. It took government regulators by surprise. It took political scientists by surprise. In the last few years, there have been a number of studies by both economists, by political psychologists, by political scientists, trying to evaluate the impact of social media on our political attitudes, on our political behavior. And you're right, it does, the evidence so far, though recent, does seem to be that it exacerbates polarization, that it seems to reduce tolerance, and that it seems to increasingly place us in an echo chamber, not only an echo chamber where we're getting unused to dealing with different views, but within the echo chambers, we grow, we move to the position of the most radical within our chamber. So the intense exposure to social media seems to have a radicalizing effect. So not only is it eroding tolerance, not only is it eroding our ability to dialogue with people of opposing views, but it seems to be radicalizing us. Now, two caveats. One is that social media did not create this polarization. Social media, we don't need social media. We do not need Facebook to polarize, to divide ourselves, right? The Spanish Civil War was not rooted in Facebook. Chileans didn't need Facebook to fall into the polarization they fell into in the 1970s. So social media is not in any way, and we should not hide behind it. It is not what's underlying our polarization. It's exacerbating it. but it's not the root cause. Secondly, and this is not my area of expertise, so I'm speaking more in hope than knowledge, but there have been many periods of media technological change in the past that we've been afraid of. We were afraid of media, we were afraid of radio. Radio seemed to bring Hitler. Radio brought Father Coughlin. We were terrified of the effect of radio and fascism in the 20s and 30s. We were worried about television giving rise to demagogues in the 1950s. And societies, politicians, and eventually regulations adapted in ways that societies and polities learned how to live with and how to regulate these media. Is that a guarantee that we'll learn how to regulate social media? Not at all. But I think that it's not inconceivable that we will. So 2016 clearly caught us by surprise. Facebook is already doing at least sort of a B+ job of weeding out at least fake news. That doesn't solve the problem of polarization, but Facebook is social media agents are paying much more attention now than they were 2 years ago. So yeah, it's scary. Yeah, it clearly exacerbates polarization. But I hope I'm not being too naive in suggesting that we've got a reasonable shot to sort of learn how to live with it.
Please, let's give us.
Thank you.
For those of you who would like to purchase a book, they will be available right in the back in the parlor, and right next to where the book purchase will happen will be the book signing table. Now, in order to make that happen, the chairs that are in the back in the parlor where those tables are going need to just be cleared. The rest of you don't necessarily need to clear the chairs, but back there is where the book signing and the book purchase will be. And thank you so much for coming.